What I want to do in this video is show you how we can get started with the domain-driven design in a real project. Now, in case you don't know, I am building a real-world SaaS where I'm using DDD and other techniques which allow me to manage a large code bases. By the way, this project has already 100K lines of code, and I'm going to talk that in a later video, but I'm going to show you how you can use domain-driven design. And getting started, you're going to see me that I'm using a limited set of DDD notions and I'm doing compromises, and I will tell you when it's worth doing such a compromise and where it's not. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump into the code and I'm going to browse the solution. So I'm having here a monolith. I'm building this SaaS as being a monolith. I had an attempt to do a modular monolith, and I do recommend to have a single domain project per bounded context. In my example, I'm doing with the procurement, and this is my domain. I'm gonna start with the money objects. This is a value object which has two fields. It has the amount and the currency, and I'm using the record to define the value objects. Now, I do recommend record for every value objects which you are implementing by default. There are a couple of exceptions, but you get for free equals and get hash code and a couple of extra benefits if you're using record. There is no need to implement your own because value objects, they have basically they are replacing primitive objects. And I'm going to talk right in a moment. And in this place, the value object has the purpose to put these two properties in a single place. The amount and the currency. It has a private constructor, and I do have the private fields which allows me to create a value money object. I'm checking the amount and the currency if it's supported or not. And I do have actually 3 currencies which are supported at the moment. I'm using the result pattern, which I'm going to talk in a later video, but that's a common result pattern. There is nothing special. And that's pretty much all. This is the money object. Now, this has actually a couple of usages. It has 17 references. And the benefit of using the money object is that you get validated money every time when you're using this. So you're just creating once, and you're going to make sure that every time when you're using the value object money, you have a valid money. The next time, it's this may be price interval. This is still a value object. I'm still using record and has a purpose to have a price interval or not. So as you can see, I have the optional lowest amount, which this can be optional. And I have the private setters. I have the currency. I have a is interval. If the lowest amount, it is different than no. And also every logic which you're seeing here, it's making sure that either I'm creating an interval or a single price. So I have 2 functions here. One of them it's used with the amount and the currency, and the second one it's with the lowest amount. So I'm expecting an interval, and I'm checking the amount. If it's null, amount should be different, the lowest should be smaller, and so on. So that's a trivial check, but this is the only place where I'm making sure the maybe price it is valid or not. Also, I have a couple of ways to parse. That's useful for testing. We're going to see when we're going to discuss about testing. And an operator which I'm using to add 2 price intervals in the same time. Now, I don't have all the operators. That's because I'm not using. These are safe to not define. If someone else will use the minus operator, it will get compile error. So it will require to implement that. So that's pretty much it. These are the value objects which I find important. I'm going to go to the next one, which are the regions. I'm also having knowledge about regions, about cities, counties, Cvp codes, nuts entities. These are some notions which are related to procurement, and especially the ones are used in European Union. So I have a couple of extra code here which checking if this is a nuts ID. I don't know how to spell it. NYTS ID. So I'm having business logic here. I have a minimum length and a maximum length. This is the value, and I'm just checking if this value has a certain format. Now, this value object can be represented by a single value. I do have here an is country, but I'm not using right now. But I could replace in every 30 references where I'm using this value object, I could safely use the string. The reason I'm not doing the string is because I want to make sure that this is still valid. So I'm having this extra validation. There should be first digit to be a country code and so on. So in every place, and actually there are a couple of few, I'm using this ID to make sure that I'm dealing with valid a valid code. Later on, there is also the not ID. Now, in this case, I'm not using a record. I'm using the equitable not ID. I could safely use a record here as well. And I'm having the same way. I'm leveraging this value object which exists already, and I'm adding extra information, regions, and so on. So as you can see, here I am building up, I'm adding a lot of logic, a lot of code about the procurement in my domain object. These are just some value objects. They don't have anything except the validation. And that's actually the purpose of having a valid object. A value object should be replaced by a primitive if it contains some extra validation that the value object by himself it is valid. I'm not talking about in a context, but by himself. And usually value objects, they have just trivial validation, like if it's null, if it respects a certain format. So this is much how I implement these two regions. The next one is the Cvp code. I'm repeating the same story. I'm having a code which I'm using a value object, so I'm not going to repeat myself, but this has a different format. I have actually added some validation and some comments here, make sure that these are valid. Now, one thing which I would like to mention is that I do have actually unit tests. So I'm gonna jump into the test explorer. So I do have 72 unit tests for the domain itself. These can guarantee that anything which I'm gonna modify later on, it will still be valid and I'm not gonna have regression. Now, I'm not validating everything, so just the one which I find important, like the CVP, the nuts, but I don't cover here all the cases. And all the unit tests I have wrote at the moment are just to cover business cases. Nothing has been implemented just to increase the code coverage. So these are the regions, the rest of them country code, they're just some enumeration. I'm not gonna go in depth for them. Now, our procurement has deal with some participants. So these are the next which I'm gonna talk. Now, the first one is the contracting authority, which this is the authority which will publish the initiation note. So this is the authority we want to buy services from bidders. So I'm using a class here. This is actually an entity with a couple of properties which I'm interested to have here. These are still value objects. This contracting authority is still a participant, and I do have here a hex. Please ignore here. I'm gonna probably remove that in a refactoring. But the important here is that contracting authorities has these three properties: ongoing, awarded, and canceled. If we're gonna go later on in the participant, I do have a couple of logic, which is properties which are related to participant, like the company ID. So every participant, it is a company. I do have type, status, register date, and so on. And I do have the company object, which is a foreign key to our company table. I'm going to talk in a moment. So these are public. I don't do any validation right now for the participant. The reason is that I'm just doing the validation in a separate place in anti-corruption layer. I'm going to talk in a later video because that's a whole complex topic about that. So I'm using public properties. I am just implemented equal. I'm implemented equitable. I'm just implemented manually, the old fashioned here. Now, this is not a production ready code. I would never approve such a thing if I would work with multiple people. And there are some compromises which you see me doing and some of them not. So the reason I'm just allowing this code to exist as it is because I'm wearing two hats. I'm wearing as the architect and I'm the developer who's gonna do the actual code. But in practice, when you're working with a team, I would never approve such a thing. So I would either require to be record or implement the equitable as it is. So I'm implemented just equally with the participant itself, but as you can see, I'm not overriding the one from objects. So while I'm very happy with what it is right now, I'm still gaining the functionality of equals because I'm using all the time participants as a type. I'm not doing any cast, but this is because I know what I'm doing. I would never approve such a thing. So I would be more strict and I would constrain this in some tests. So this is what you have to keep in mind of that. If you're getting started with the DDD, you can do a compromise here. Now I want to just to show you what I'm talking about. So let's say I do have define here participant and I do new participant, and part has equals, has two properties. As you can see, there are two overrides. There's the one from the objects and the one from the participant. If I'm just casting here to object, I have the only one from object, which here, if I'm using this override, I will not have two participants as being equal, right? Now here, this is an interface just to know and to tell the C# compiler to use this override when both types are known, like the other and the this. Okay, so the next one is gonna be the bidder. This is the participant which is bidding. So I still have two value objects the same, which are named different. One and the one have participated. This bidder is still inheriting from participants, so all the code which you have seen previously, it's still applying here. Also here I'm using the class, I'm not using a record because I'm doing a compromise. I will never allow such a thing to go in production. The next one are the status, the type, and the procedure info, which we have seen here. But that's pretty much the participants. So an authority, it's publishing a notice, which I'm gonna jump into right now. So this is the invitation notice where it allows other companies, other bidders to participate too. So this is still an entity, but I don't have any domain about events. I'm not constraining by inheriting a certain entity yet. This invitation procedure, and actually the other ones as well, could be an entity, but I'm not inheriting from any best practice domain-driven design because I'm doing a compromise. Like I have told you, when you get started with the DD, you can do that, but in practice, I would never allow to do such a thing. So this invitation procedure actually has a lot of properties. All the properties are private, and by the way, in case I have not mentioned, all the properties which I do have in participant and everything which I have seen previously are private. And this is a compromise which I'll never make to make it public, except the ones which are referring to foreign keys. But usually I allow the foreign keys to be private set. Only the entities which are related to the aggregate root I'm allowing to be private. Now this invitation procedure, it should be more than an entity. It should be actually an aggregate root. It should contain logic about the suppliers, about everyone who is participating. The reason I'm not doing that is because I'm dealing already with valid data externally. So I'm making assumptions that some of the data is valid and most of the data I'm doing in the anti-corruption layer. Again, this is a class. Don't do that in practice, but do that if you're getting started. Here I don't have nothing more and just I'm public. I'm allowing creating public, and this is for entity framework because I'm doing the validation somewhere else. As you can see, there's not too much need to do the validation here because I'm using a lot of these value objects have seen in the past. So all these value objects are already valid. So it affords me to skip the validation and just have a classic constructor because I'm going to receive valid entities anyway. The next one is the notice number. So you have heard probably to get rid of the primitives like integers, strings, and instead use value objects, which actually is the case here. So here this notice number, it has mainly the purpose to store a valid string, but it has also a property, the version. In this case, it contains logic if the version is 1 or 2, but you can simply ignore that. So the only purpose I'm just doing the notice number here is just to have a single place where I validate that number. So I have 22 occurrences where I'm creating the notice number and I'm doing a validation, should not be length, blah, 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 and so on. This is a place where I'm putting all the validation to have a notice number valid. And I'm using in a lot of places, inclusive unit tests. This is a record where I do recommend actually to write a record. I have mentioned previously, all the value objects should be by default record, or at least implement the properties yourself. So this is the invitation procedure. Now, some of the properties I keep it as primitive. For instance, site ID, despite it could be. Notice number, this is an enumeration. The version, it's a byte. The reference number, I'm still keeping as a string. That's because I really don't care what's the reference number. So you will just write the value objects when you have added logic or you have put in the domain knowledge about the system you are building. Here, I'm not dealing anywhere else with the reference number. Actually, you can see the low usage is 3 references. So that's the reason I'm just keeping a nullable string. Contract type is also enumeration. The date time, well, what you can see is just the date time. So I'm keeping as a native type. The rest of them are just a couple of objects which I'm using own entities to basically group the properties more. So here the authority is a company, the domain, and so on. But these are some own properties. The only purpose of them is just to group and to be easily used by anyone who is entering the project. The next one is assigned project. It respects the same structure. Again, not perfect. I'm just inheriting from this interface to tell you that this is a procedure notice. This is just a contract to get to not miss any mandatory properties. And it's a place where I'm using. So nothing fancy, everything which is private. Here I'm doing an extra validation. For instance, I'm doing original price. It's a converted price. If these two are references, if it is the same references, then I'm gonna throw an exception. The reason I'm throwing an exception and I'm not using the result pattern, the reason I'm throwing an exception is because Entity Framework by default is keeping tracking of the own entities by references. So I'm making sure here I do have different references. And the rest, it's just simply not important, I say. So that's pretty much with the notice. I do have actually other types, but I'm not going to go through every value object because the story, it will repeat. The next one are suppliers. A supplier, it's basically a set of companies that supply a certain procedure. That's the reason I'm having an abstract class, is because I do have 2 types of suppliers. So I'm creating the abstract class just to put some common logic. For instance, I'm having the private read-only here, a list of participants, and I'm exposing a read-only list. And I'm just controlling this list by add participant and remove participant. And I do have a couple of constraints. One of them should be a leader and so on. These are constraints in my domain in a procedure supplier. So this validation actually makes sense here. I actually have a lot of logic for it has a company and so on. Now, do you think this code is perfect? Actually, not at all. Have a look here. I'm exposing a private list, which should never happen. Even if I'm exposing this, it's a private. The fact that it's list, it allows consumers to add and remove contracts here. Now, I'm not controlling right now the signed contracts, but you would typically do the same story I have did here. So this is a potential place to refactor, and again, because I'm wearing 2 hats, but in a production ready code, I will not approve that, because if I'm dealing with a lot of junior or mid employees, I would prefer to just have some tests which they fail instead having potential problems, especially in our domain. So again, not a perfect class. I'm not implemented equals. I'm not doing anything else. Let's have a look to the usages. So I do have, this is the invitation procedure. It's inheriting for that procedure, and it adds a couple of properties. and of course it will inherit the functions from the base class. That's actually an assign, so the story repeats. Now adding abstract though constraint might decrease my development time. So I have made these compromises because I want to have deliver feature, but probably we're going to do a refactoring later on. And the story repeats. I'm just going to talk about the companies. So I'm going to open the company. This should be an entity as well. Again, record, so on. But this class has actually something special. So I have, again, usages of some value objects like the registration number. And I do have some private static here. Now, this domain, it has a reference to an external library. And you may have heard that this should never happen. The domain should be pure. Well, I don't think it should be as a rule. And the exception I'm typically allowing is when the domain is referencing a library which is mathematically, or it allows you to put the logic and to help you to fulfill the logic in your domain. Mathematical operations are typically the one which I allow to add reference to the domain. This is what I'm doing. I'm using these mathematical libraries to compute a couple of things like the company name distance and a couple of comparers, but these are private static only. And I'm using in a couple of methods to compare companies, to set registration number. This company, it is not a record, it is an entity, but let's have a look to what we are having. So I'm implementing equal like company like I have did previously. What I'm doing is actually comparing manually. I'm overriding the object one, and I'm letting the hash code to be using only to the hash. So that's a logic where I'm overriding the behavior that two companies are equal. I'm just using the hash, and using record here would not work. So in this case, I'm just implementing by my own. But if I would have some tests, I would just pass those tests. I would not have to put the company as a record. If I would do that, I would actually change the behavior and having the class not working as properly. So that's pretty much it. This is how our domain is looking right now. It's not perfect. It's far from being perfect, but I think it's a great point to get started with the domain-driven design. I'm not using events. I'm not doing integration event. I'm not using aggregate routes. I'm going to add those references, and I'm going to use those as long as I need. But right now, I don't need them. I think I'm very happy with that. But let me know what you think. Even if you are a DDD practitioner, even if you're getting started, I really want to hear your opinion, right? With the caveats I have told. Let me know in the comments which part would you like to elaborate more, or maybe I have not covered, and that should be the subject for the next video. I'm Daniel, and until the next time, see you soon. Bye.